July 4th, 1944, Camp Mexia, Texas. The mess hall smelled of frying oil and warm bread. Fans hummed against the noon heat as rows of German prisoners filed inside, still wearing their patched khaki from the Afrika Korps. They were sunburned, polite, silent. On the tables waited metal trays, fried chicken legs, mashed potatoes, white bread, and a glass bottle of Coca-Cola, sweating in the heat. The guards had the same meal. There were no speeches, no flags, just lunch. Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer stared at his plate. The golden crust glistened with grease. He could smell salt and pepper, something rich, almost sweet. Across the table, his comrade murmured, "It's a trick. They want to make us forget." Karl nodded, unsure. He had not seen meat this thick since North Africa. The Coca-Cola hissed when opened. Tiny bubbles rose and broke. He remembered Goebbels' broadcasts mocking America's decadence, a nation of sugar and jazz. Yet here he sat, a prisoner, surrounded by more food than his unit had seen in months. A young guard leaned on the doorway, chewing his own piece of chicken. "Eat up, boys," he said with a grin. "Same for everyone today." The Germans hesitated. A few pushed the trays away. Pride burned hotter than hunger. But one man, thin and shaking, reached out and took a bite. The crunch echoed in the quiet room. He chewed slowly, eyes watering. Another followed, then another. Karl picked up the bottle. The label was bright red, the liquid dark and cold. He brought it to his lips. The first taste was shock, sugar, bubbles, something alive. He coughed, laughed once, and lowered the bottle. Around him, men who had marched through dust and blood were quietly crying. A corporal whispered, "Even our officers never ate like this." Karl looked at the food again. "They fight a world war," he said softly, "and still eat like kings." Outside, the camp loudspeaker played swing music. Inside, the prisoners sat frozen before a meal that mocked everything they had believed about their enemy. On that day, the war ended not in battle, but in the arithmetic of lunch, calories, sweetness, and the unbearable taste of defeat. For years, the men of the Wehrmacht had been told that America was soft. Newspapers called it a nation of chewing gum and jazz, a culture addicted to comfort. Propaganda films mocked the Coca-Cola bottle as a symbol of decay, proof that the Americans had traded discipline for indulgence. Karl Fischer believed every word. In North Africa, he had fought under slogans that glorified hardship. The desert sun and sand were proof of strength, the empty rations a badge of purity. "We are forged by struggle," his commander once said. "They are dulled by ease." He repeated that phrase like prayer, even as he watched his comrades scrape rust from empty tins. To suffer was to be superior. To endure without complaint was to be German. In camp, those beliefs came with him, wrapped around his pride like armor. The sight of fried chicken and Coca-Cola felt like mockery. He whispered, "They want to make us laugh at ourselves." But the guards didn't laugh. They sat beside the prisoners, eating the same food with the same calm rhythm. They didn't flaunt abundance. They normalized it. And that broke the illusion more deeply than ridicule ever could. Karl remembered what his company had eaten in Tunisia. Half a loaf of bread, watery soup, sometimes horse meat. They had fought in 120-degree heat with one canteen per man. Now, in a camp surrounded by barbed wire, his enemy handed him sugar and meat as if it were nothing. The contradiction was unbearable. German propaganda had promised that America's luxury would collapse in total war. Yet the trucks kept arriving, full of food. The camp kitchen never ran out. "Even their prisoners eat better than our civilians," Karl muttered. For the first time, he questioned what strength really meant. If discipline was hunger and indulgence was weakness, why was the weak side feeding the world? At night, he lay awake, listening to the distant hum of refrigeration units, a sound he had never heard in Europe during the war. The Americans had mechanized comfort. The next morning, when a guard poured him coffee thick with sugar, Karl didn't refuse. He drank slowly, trying to taste what defeat actually meant. It wasn't humiliation, it was confusion, the slow unraveling of a belief system built on scarcity and pride. He thought of the radio back home, the speeches about national honor. Then he looked at the Coca-Cola bottle on his tray, clear and ordinary, glowing in the sunlight. What if the real superiority was not endurance, but the ability to make life easy? In that thought, the foundations of his loyalty began to crumble. The two worlds that met in that Texas mess hall had begun diverging long before the first shots of the war. In Germany, the economy of the 1930s was a war machine disguised as a nation. Every farm, factory, and mill was repurposed for conquest. Butter gave way to bullets, tractors to tanks. The Reich's economic miracle was only sustainable while stealing from its neighbors. When the plunder ended, starvation began. By 1944, German soldiers lived on 1,500 calories a day. Their rations were shrinking even as propaganda declared total victory. Civilians fared worse. Bread was stretched with sawdust filler. Meat vanished from markets. Sugar was a memory. Coffee was roasted barley. Across the Atlantic, America fought a different kind of war. It mobilized not only its soldiers, but its supermarkets, farms, and soda fountains. The American way of life didn't shut down. It accelerated. In 1943, the U.S. Department of Agriculture reported record yields: 24 billion pounds of meat, 90 million acres of wheat, and 8 billion gallons of milk. The country was feeding itself, its allies, and now its enemies. Coca-Cola became a logistical symbol of that abundance. The company received a direct order from General Eisenhower in 1943. Every man in uniform should have a Coke. Within months, the company built 64 new bottling plants near military bases and ports. Each one operated under the slogan, "Open a bottle, open a front." Even in wartime, the assembly lines never stopped. The result was staggering. By the end of the war, Coca-Cola had produced more than 2.3 billion bottles, many of them consumed on foreign soil. Where Germany rationed everything, America exported refreshment. The difference wasn't only industrial, it was philosophical. Germany worshipped control, measuring every crumb. America worshipped flow, constant motion, constant delivery. In the Reich, luxury was treason. In America, luxury was morale. Carl Fischer's lunch that day in Texas was not a coincidence. It was the product of a system designed to make comfort strategic. The fried chicken came from refrigerated trucks, supplied through rail lines that crossed an entire continent. The Coca-Cola bottle had traveled from a glass plant in Georgia to a bottling facility in Dallas, chilled by ice produced in industrial freezers that ran day and night. To the Germans, that level of organization for a drink seemed impossible. To the Americans, it was simply Tuesday. When Carl saw the food pile up without ration cards, he understood something no lecture could teach. The United States had mastered the logistics of happiness. It wasn't decadence. It was infrastructure. And it was unstoppable. The difference between the Reich and the Republic could be written in one language: numbers. In 1944, the United States produced 24 billion pounds of meat, while Germany managed barely 3 billion. American citizens consumed nearly 20 times more sugar per capita than German civilians. Each U.S. soldier received an average of 4,000 calories per day, while a German infantryman was issued 1,500, and often less once transport collapsed. The math of war was merciless. A single U.S. train could deliver 200 tons of refrigerated food daily from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast. Across the ocean, the Wehrmacht fought for weeks on horse-drawn wagons and moldy bread. At Camp Mexia, Carl Fischer's lunch tray reflected those statistics more clearly than any chart. His chicken leg represented a national surplus. His Coke bottle was a product of 64 functioning bottling plants operating under military protection. Together, they were symbols of an economy that could fight a global war and still dine well at noon. The Red Cross documented the contrast. American POW camps averaged 3,200 calories per prisoner per day, the same as U.S. soldiers. German POW camps, by 1945, fell below 900. Even the costs told a story. Washington spent $1.80 per POW per day, including meals, labor pay, and medical care. That was 3 times the daily income of a German civilian in 1944. The Reich's ideology praised simplicity, yet its simplicity was starvation. The United States industrialized indulgence and made it routine. Then there was sugar, the real weapon of morale. The U.S. sugar supply in 1944 reached 7.5 million tons, enough to sweeten every ration and still pour into sodas and desserts. Germany's sugar output had collapsed to under 900,000 tons, much of it reserved for explosives and chemical production. Coca-Cola's own numbers revealed the absurdity of the imbalance. 2.3 billion bottles a year, 64 domestic factories, and 10 bottling plants abroad near combat zones. In contrast, German soft drink production had ceased almost entirely by 1943. Karl looked at those numbers later in a post-war magazine and realized they were not just statistics, they were the measure of an idea. America's power came from a system that made excess sustainable. Not domination by tanks, but by calories. Not superiority in discipline, but in distribution. Every fried chicken leg, every cold drink, every full stomach became arithmetic proof that ideology could not feed a nation. Germany's empire was built on command. America's was built on delivery, and the numbers favored the latter without mercy. When Karl took his next sip of Coca-Cola, he wasn't just tasting sugar. He was tasting an equation that Germany could never solve. The 4th of July sun baked the roofs of Camp Mexia until they shimmered like tin mirrors. Inside the camp kitchen, American cooks prepared what they called a morale lunch. Rows of cast-iron skillets hissed as chicken legs sizzled in oil. The smell rolled across the barracks thick and rich. When the meal bell rang, 400 German prisoners filed into the mess hall. The guards watched with folded arms, amused. On each tray sat fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, white bread, and a chilled Coca-Cola bottle. For the Americans, it was just another meal. For the Germans, it was theater. Karl Fischer sat among them, motionless. "We will not eat their arrogance," a comrade muttered beside him. The others nodded. It was a point of honor, a last defense against humiliation. To accept this meal was to admit everything propaganda had denied. The guards didn't react. They ate beside the prisoners, the same portions, the same Coke. The act was quiet equality, and that was what broke the tension. Minutes passed. The smell filled the room. One man at the end of the table, a former panzer mechanic from Hanover, sniffed the air and whispered, "I can't remember the last time I smelled real food." His hand shook as he reached forward. He tore off a piece of chicken, took a bite, and froze. The crunch was sharp, followed by the taste of salt, oil, and warmth. Tears came without warning. He covered his mouth and kept eating. Across the hall, others followed. Forks clattered, words failed. For men who had lived on boiled barley and moldy bread, the flavor was unbearable in its simplicity. Karl lifted his bottle. Condensation slid over his fingers. He twisted the cap and heard the hiss, like a sigh of something alive. The first sip was too sweet, too strange, but he drank again. "Even our officers never ate like this," he said. The guards laughed softly, not unkindly. "Welcome to democracy," one of them said. In that instant, the room changed. Pride turned to quiet awe. For the first time since capture, the Germans saw their captors not as conquerors, but as inhabitants of another world, one that could afford generosity. Later that night, in the barracks, no one spoke of escape. They spoke of the meal. "If they can feed prisoners like this," one said, "what must their soldiers eat?" Karl wrote a line in his small notebook. We were told they were weak, but their weakness tastes like strength. The fried chicken incident, as guards later called it, spread to other camps in stories and whispers. A single lunch had become psychological warfare more effective than any speech. No punishment, no propaganda, only abundance. The realization struck deeper than defeat itself. A society that could share comfort had already won. In the weeks after the fried chicken meal, something subtle shifted inside Camp Mexia. The guards noticed it first. The morning roll calls were quieter, the tension gone from the air. The German prisoners no longer avoided eye contact. Some even smiled. Word had spread to other camps across Texas and Oklahoma. The Americans give prisoners Coca-Cola, one letter home said. They eat chicken every week. The German censors deleted those sentences, but not before many had read them aloud in disbelief. Back in Germany, civilians boiled nettles for soup, scraped mold from bread, and buried children lost to hunger. To the men behind American fences, it was unbearable to imagine that their families were starving while they dined in abundance. Carl Fischer felt it every day. He wrote to his wife but could not tell her what he was eating. Instead, he described the weather, the work, the silence. He left out the part where he washed his hands with real soap and drank cold soda from a glass bottle. Inside the camp, the Americans continued their routines. 3 meals a day, weekly medical checks, movies on Sundays. To them, this was normal procedure. To the Germans, it was civilization made visible. A former lieutenant whispered one evening, "We thought our discipline made us noble. Now I think it only made us hungry." That single sentence captured the collapse of an entire ideology. The Reich had preached that hardship purified the soul, that deprivation built unity. Yet comfort, not control, seemed to create order here. The camp ran smoothly not through threats, but through supply. When an officer from Washington toured the compound, he noted in his report, "Discipline maintained through routine abundance. No resistance incidents since July." It was administration as philosophy. Outside, the contrast deepened. Allied bombing had erased rail lines. The German food system, once praised as efficient, had disintegrated. In the final months of the war, average civilian calorie intake dropped below 1,200 per day. Meanwhile, Camp Mexia's kitchen logs showed 3,100 calories per prisoner. Meat, milk, sugar, each measured, delivered, recorded. The arithmetic was merciless. Carl stared at those ledgers one afternoon while helping the quartermaster. He saw the numbers, the scales, the shipments. It wasn't luck, it was engineering. "They have made generosity mechanical," he said. By autumn, most prisoners had stopped calling America decadent. They used another word, organized. The concept of moral superiority through suffering had collapsed under the weight of consistent comfort. The guards didn't gloat. They didn't have to. Every warm meal, every refill of Coca-Cola, every full night's sleep delivered the same message. You lost to a civilization that never ran out. Hunger had once been the Germans' pride. Now it was their shame. And humility, the kind born not from sermons but from full stomachs, settled in like a new season. By late summer 1944, Camp Mexia had become more than a holding site. It was a functioning experiment in civilization management. The Americans didn't design it that way, but the effect was unmistakable. Each morning, trains arrived with supplies: flour, sugar, eggs, frozen chicken, soda crates marked Dallas Bottling Works. Inside the quartermaster's office, every shipment was recorded by weight and temperature. The efficiency was hypnotic. Carl Fischer, now assigned to kitchen detail, saw it all from inside. He had once serviced tank engines in the desert. Now he inspected ice machines and food thermometers. "Even the cold is scheduled," he wrote. The camp's daily menu read like a factory blueprint of comfort. Breakfast eggs, coffee with sugar, bread and jam. Lunch, meat and vegetables. Supper, stew, fruit, and always a bottle of Coca-Cola. The guards didn't speak of mercy. They called it regulation. That distinction struck Carl deeply. The Americans didn't act generous. They acted efficient. Decency was built into their system. Red Cross reports confirmed it. One inspection noted, "Morale stable. Prisoners expressed disbelief at the consistency of rations. No food-related complaints since July." The effects rippled beyond the dining hall. Work productivity in the camp's agricultural labor detachments rose by 40%. Prisoners volunteered for shifts, cleaned barracks, maintained equipment without being ordered. The chain of command had inverted. Discipline through satisfaction. One U.S. officer wrote to Washington, "It appears that consistent nourishment creates obedience faster than punishment ever did." His observation would later influence post-war re-education policies. Carl became fascinated with the logistics itself. He mapped the supply chain on paper. Rail lines from Iowa to Dallas, trucks to Mexia, distribution by clipboard and ledger. Each step precise, predictable, humanless. He began to understand that America's power wasn't luck, it was rhythm. "Their civilization," he told another prisoner, "is a machine that feeds itself." In the evenings, he and his comrades drank Coke on the barracks steps. The fizz became background noise to their new reality. What had begun as humiliation was turning into awe. They still called themselves soldiers, but the word felt hollow now. Their enemy had conquered without force, through comfort repeated until it became truth. A young prisoner summed it up one night. "We thought they pampered themselves, but they simply learned how to make decency automatic." Camp Mexia became known among guards as the Coca-Cola camp. Newspapers back home never mentioned it, but military psychologists noted it as evidence of behavioral stabilization through controlled abundance. Carl only called it one thing: proof. Proof that the side which could feed its prisoners could have fed the whole world, and chose not to starve anyone. When he lay in his bunk, the distant clink of soda bottles from the canteen sounded like a clock ticking in another civilization. For the first time, he no longer wanted to escape. He wanted to understand how it worked. In 1946, the war was over, but its taste lingered. The German prisoners began to leave Camp Mexia in groups of 50, bound for Europe on troop ships. The Americans saw them off with the same efficiency that had defined everything else. Each man received a final ration bag, bread, meat, and one last bottle of Coca-Cola. On the ship, Carl Fisher held that bottle as the Texas coast faded into haze. Around him, men joked quietly, but the laughter carried an unease. The soda fizzed gently in the heat. It was the sound of something finished. When they reached Bremerhaven, the dock was gray, the air metallic with coal smoke. The port was half rubble, half mud. There was no food smell, no music, no sound of engines. Germany had stopped humming. The men disembarked in silence. The Red Cross handed them soup so thin it reflected the sky. Carl didn't drink it right away. He still held the Coke bottle, cold and sweating. He had saved it for his wife, a token of another world. When he reached Bremen, the city was a skeleton. Bridges gone, windows shattered, factories twisted. His home street was dust. His wife stood in the doorway of a one-room shelter, thinner than he remembered. She looked at the bottle in his hand and asked, "What is that?" "America," he said. He opened it and gave her the first sip. She coughed at the sweetness, then stared at the glass like it was treasure. In the weeks that followed, he tried to describe the camp, the meals, the order, the endless supplies, but people didn't believe him. "Propaganda," one neighbor said. "They would never feed prisoners like that." Carl only answered, "They could afford to." Newspapers soon carried reports of German POWs praising American treatment. One editor wrote angrily that such talk undermined national dignity. But there was no dignity left in hunger. Across Europe, former prisoners shared the same story: Coca-Cola, fried chicken, fair treatment. It sounded impossible to people who lived on ration cards and ashes. Yet the stories kept spreading. The contrast was merciless. In 1946, the average German civilian consumed 200 calories a day. In Camp Mexia, it had been 3,200. Factories here couldn't make soap. America was exporting chocolate. Carl began working as a mechanic in a British zone depot. He saw the first shipments of American aid arrive: powdered milk, sugar, cigarettes, soap. The labels were in English, but to him they all said the same thing: power wrapped in generosity. One day he passed a store where a Coca-Cola sign hung crooked in the window, newly imported. He stopped and stared. A young boy came out holding a bottle and offered him a sip. Carl took it. The taste was exactly the same as in Texas: sweet, cold, and final. He realized then that the drink was no longer foreign. It was the flavor of a world that had moved on without them. At night, he told his wife, "They beat us with plenty. We thought victory was discipline, but victory was comfort." History would call it reconstruction, democracy, recovery. For men like Carl, it was simpler. Defeat tasted like Coca-Cola. By 1946, the lesson of Camp Mexia had spread far beyond Texas. It echoed quietly through every returning prisoner's letter, every whispered story at a bombed-out kitchen table. The lesson was simple, humiliating, undeniable. America's true weapon had not been steel or fire, but the ability to make comfort ordinary. Carl Fisher came to understand that his defeat had not begun when he surrendered in Tunisia. It began years earlier when the Reich declared that hunger was honor and that luxury was rot. The lie had been beautiful, disciplined, fatal. Germany built rockets that touched the edge of space but could not feed its people. It engineered tanks that broke through sand and snow, but could not keep its hospitals supplied. It mastered fear, not prosperity. The United States fought differently. It fought with abundance, with order disguised as chaos, with production so immense it looked effortless. Even mercy was mass-produced. The same system that built bombers also bottled soda, baked bread, and fried chicken for its captives. Carl saw the meaning of that arithmetic too late. The Reich's mathematics of sacrifice had been replaced by the Republic's mathematics of satisfaction. In the end, the numbers told the story: 1,500 calories versus 4,000, scarcity versus surplus, punishment versus procedure. He kept one empty Coca-Cola bottle on his windowsill in Bremen, not as a souvenir of captivity, but as a monument to the world that had beaten him. When sunlight passed through the glass, it turned red, the same color as the label he'd once feared. He wrote in his journal, "They taught us that excess is decay, but they showed us that comfort, repeated until it becomes normal, is civilization itself." The Reich had demanded loyalty through hunger. The Americans created loyalty by never letting their people starve. Not domination by force, but domination by routine. Not propaganda, but refrigeration. When the next generation of Germans drank their first Coca-Cola, they weren't tasting American culture. They were tasting the future. Industrial peace disguised as sugar and fizz. Carl once believed strength came from what a nation could endure. He died believing strength came from what a nation could spare. The final verdict of that war was not written in Berlin or Washington. It was written on lunch trays, in calories and kindness. Civilization, he realized, is not measured by its weapons, but by how easily it feeds both friend and foe. The story of Camp Mexia doesn't end with surrender. It ends with understanding. When the German POWs tasted Coca-Cola and fried chicken, they weren't just meeting their captors, they were meeting the future. The United States had proven something no empire before it had managed: that efficiency and kindness could coexist, that logistics could become morality. The Reich demanded sacrifice from its people until there was nothing left to give. America fed everyone in reach, even its enemies, and still had more. That was the invisible weapon of the war: abundance. Coca-Cola bottles clinked in barracks, on airfields, and in front-line tents from Texas to Tunisia. Each one was a declaration that production itself could be patriotic, that pleasure could serve strategy. It was the empire of plenty made visible. Sugar and carbonation turned into soft power. The Germans had built rockets to win the skies. The Americans had built pipelines of refreshment that wrapped the world. By the time the fighting ended, the brand was everywhere, its red label glowing even in occupied Europe. Soldiers and civilians alike learned the same silent truth. Victory could taste like sweetness. Carl Fischer never forgot that taste. For him, it was not indulgence. It was evidence. The fizz, the chill, the effortless repetition of comfort. All of it whispered the same idea. Civilization endures when it makes life easier, not harder. The arithmetic of war had been rewritten, measured in calories, comfort, and the confidence to share both. If you think wars are won by bullets, think again.